The first snowfall came early that year in Michigan's Upper Peninsula, covering the roads in white silence before Halloween had even passed. The trees around the small town of Black River stood frozen and ancient, their bare branches clawing at a sky the color of old iron. The locals were used to hard winters, to isolation, to stories whispered around wood stoves and hunting camps. But there was one story they did not speak about anymore. At the center of Black River lived an Ojibwe elder named Eli Saginaw. He was nearly 80 years old and carried himself with the kind of quiet authority that made people lower their voices when he entered a room. His face was lined deeply from years spent in the wind and cold, and his silver hair hung to his shoulders beneath a worn fur cap. Many of the older tribal families still came to him for guidance, but most of the younger generation considered him a relic from another era. Eli had spent his entire life near the forest surrounding Lake Superior. He knew every trail, every hidden stream, every abandoned mining road swallowed by moss and time. He had hunted there as a boy beside his grandfather and learned the old teachings passed down through generations. Some of those teachings were sacred. Others were warnings. In November of 1998, Eli walked into the town council building carrying a bundle wrapped in red cloth. Snow melted from his boots onto the wooden floor as the council members looked up impatiently. They were discussing a new logging contract with a private company from Wisconsin. The company planned to cut deep into a section of forest north of Black River, a place known to the Ojibwe as Makadmitagong, the Black Woods. The council chairman sighed heavily when he saw Eli. "Mr. Saginaw," he said, "we're in the middle of something. You should stop," Eli replied. The room grew still. One of the council members rolled his eyes. "Not this again." Eli stepped closer to the table. "You cannot let them cut those trees." "Why?" another man asked. "Because of another spirit story." Eli carefully unwrapped the red cloth bundle. Inside rested several old bones tied together with strips of leather darkened by age. Some appeared human, others did not. "My grandfather found these in the Black Woods when he was young," Eli said quietly. His grandfather warned him never to go there after sunset. There are places in that forest where the earth is wrong. Places where things sleep under the ground. The chairman rubbed his temples impatiently. "Mr. Saginaw, we appreciate your traditions, but this town needs jobs." Eli's dark eyes moved around the room. "You think the forest belongs to you because you draw lines on paper. But the old things there were ancient before your roads, before your churches, before your maps." A few council members exchanged uncomfortable glances. "Please," Eli said, "leave the Black Woods alone." Nobody answered. Outside, the wind howled against the windows. The logging began 2 weeks later. The company arrived with heavy equipment, portable trailers, floodlights, and nearly 20 workers. They set up camp along an old service road leading deep into the forest. At first everything seemed normal. Trees fell, machinery roared, trucks hauled timber south each morning. Then the noises started. Several workers reported hearing strange sounds after dark. Some described distant screaming that echoed through the trees for hours. Others heard heavy footsteps circling the camp at night. One man swore he saw something tall moving between the pines beyond the floodlights. The foreman dismissed the stories as nerves. But by the second week, men began quitting. A chainsaw operator named Carl Jensen refused to return after he discovered massive tracks in the snow nearly half a mile from camp. The footprints resembled human prints but were impossibly large and strangely deep, as though whatever made them weighed hundreds of pounds. Another worker claimed he found deer hanging upside down from tree branches nearly 20 feet high. Their bodies had been opened with surgical precision. No organs remained inside. The company threatened lawsuits against anyone spreading rumors. Then a man disappeared. His name was Peter Larkin, 26 years old, newly married, from Green Bay. He vanished during a night shift while operating machinery near a ravine north of camp. The bulldozer was later found still running, headlights pointed into darkness. Peter was gone. Search teams combed the forest for 3 days. They found no body, only blood. Large amounts of it stained the snow near the ravine. There were drag marks leading into the trees, but they abruptly ended after 50 yards as if whatever carried him had simply vanished. The sheriff's department blamed wolves. Eli Saginaw heard about the disappearance from his nephew Isaac, who worked maintenance for the logging company. That evening Eli visited the camp. The workers gathered around burn barrels smoking cigarettes while snow drifted through the darkness. They fell silent as the old man approached. The foreman stepped forward irritably. "You can't be here. You opened the ground," Eli said. The foreman frowned. What? You dug too deep. One of the workers muttered, Jesus Christ. Eli looked beyond them toward the forest. Did you find stones? Nobody answered. The old man's expression hardened. You did. The foreman crossed his arms. Look, old man, we found some rocks while clearing land. So what? They were arranged in circles. Silence. Several workers exchanged uneasy glances. Eli nodded slowly as though confirming his worst fear. You should leave now. The foreman laughed nervously. You trying to scare us? No, Eli replied. I am trying to save you. That night the temperature dropped below zero. At 2:13 a.m., the camp generators failed simultaneously. The floodlights died. Darkness swallowed everything. Workers stumbled from trailers shouting in confusion while mechanics rushed to inspect the generators. Snow fell thickly from the sky, muting sound across the forest. Then came the scream. It erupted from somewhere beyond the trees, long and unnatural, neither human nor animal. Men froze where they stood. Another scream answered from farther away. Then another. Within seconds the forest echoed with horrifying cries circling the camp from every direction. Panic spread instantly. Workers grabbed flashlights and tools while several ran for their trucks. One mechanic later claimed he saw figures moving between the trees, impossibly tall silhouettes slipping silently through the snow. The screaming stopped abruptly. A terrible silence followed. Then something hit the side of one trailer with enough force to dent the metal inward. Men shouted. Another impact struck a fuel tank, knocking it onto its side. Someone fired a pistol blindly into the darkness. For a brief moment, illuminated by muzzle flash, several workers saw a shape standing beyond the floodlights. It appeared vaguely human, but far too tall. Its limbs were wrong, and its eyes reflected white. The camp evacuated before dawn. By morning, the logging company suspended operations indefinitely. The official explanation cited dangerous winter conditions. But rumors spread quickly through Black River. Eli Saginaw knew the danger had only begun. 3 nights later, a family living near the edge of town reported scratching sounds outside their farmhouse. The father stepped onto the porch with a shotgun and vanished. His wife heard only one scream. Police found blood in the snow beside the porch stairs. No tracks. No body. Fear settled over Black River like a sickness. People locked doors before sunset. Businesses closed early. Hunters stopped entering the forest alone. Eli spent those nights burning cedar outside his home and speaking prayers in Ojibwe beneath his breath. His grandson Daniel watched nervously from the doorway. Daniel was 24 years old and had spent most of his life rejecting tribal traditions. He studied journalism at college in Marquette and believed stories should be explained logically. But even he could not ignore what was happening. Tell me the truth, Daniel said one evening. What's out there? Eli stared into the fire for a long time before answering. When I was a child, he said quietly, my grandfather took me into the Black Woods. We traveled for 2 days until we reached a valley where nothing grew. No birds sang there. No insects moved. The earth itself smelled rotten. Daniel listened silently. In the center of the valley stood stones arranged in circles. Ancient stones older than our people. My grandfather told me our ancestors avoided that place for centuries. They believed something came there from beneath the earth during the long winters. What kind of thing? Eli shook his head slowly. No word exists for it now. The old stories called them the Hollow Ones. Daniel frowned. That sounds like mythology. Maybe, Eli said, but stories survive for reasons. The fire crackled softly. My grandfather told me the Hollow Ones were not animals. They wore shapes the way men wear coats. They learned voices. They copied sounds. Sometimes they called to people using the voices of loved ones. Daniel felt cold despite the fire. That's impossible. Eli finally looked at him. So is disappearing without tracks. The following week brought another disappearance. Then another. State police arrived along with search teams and wildlife experts. Reporters descended on Black River searching for explanations. Most assumed a dangerous predator was responsible. Eli knew better. One night Daniel woke to frantic pounding on the front door. He opened it to find Isaac covered in blood and trembling violently. They took him, Isaac gasped. Eli appeared instantly. Who? Isaac struggled to breathe. Tommy. We were driving back from the gas station when something ran across the road. We stopped and he began shaking uncontrollably. What did you see? Eli demanded. Isaac's eyes filled with terror. It looked like a man at first. Tall, naked, white skin, but its arms, he swallowed hard. They were too long. Daniel exchanged a fearful glance with his grandfather. Isaac continued speaking in a whisper. Tommy got out of the truck. The thing started talking to him. What did it say? It sounded like his mother. Silence filled the room. It called his name, Isaac whispered. Exactly like her voice. Daniel felt goosebumps rise across his arms. What happened next? Isaac stared blankly ahead. It opened its mouth. He began sobbing. It wasn't human. By dawn, state police launched another search operation. They found Tommy's truck abandoned on a logging road. The driver's side door hung open. Blood covered the snow nearby. Again, no tracks. The sheriff finally visited Eli. Sheriff Nolan Briggs was a practical man in his 50s who had spent decades dismissing local legends. But exhaustion lined his face as he sat across from the old elder. People are dying, Briggs said quietly. If you know something, now's the time. Eli studied him for several moments. You will not like the answer. I don't care. The old man nodded slowly. The Black Woods were sealed long ago. Briggs rubbed his forehead impatiently. Sealed from what? From things buried beneath. The sheriff exhaled heavily. I'm trying very hard to take this seriously. You should. Eli stood and retrieved an old leather-bound journal from a shelf. The pages inside were brittle with age. This belonged to my grandfather. Briggs examined faded sketches drawn in black ink. Strange humanoid figures crouched among trees. Circular stone formations appeared repeatedly throughout the journal. What is this? Records, Eli said. One entry described entire hunting parties vanishing during the winter of 1879. Another told of voices calling from beneath frozen lakes. Several pages contained warnings written in Ojibwe. Briggs stared uneasily at one illustration. The creature depicted there had enormous white eyes and a mouth extending far too wide across its face. When the logging company broke the stone circles, Eli said, they opened paths that should have remained closed. The sheriff closed the journal slowly. You actually believe these things are real? Eli's expression did not change. I know they are. That night, Sheriff Briggs ordered roadblocks around Black River and imposed an unofficial curfew. State authorities protested, but Briggs no longer cared how irrational it sounded. Then the bodies appeared. A snowmobiler discovered the first one hanging from a cedar tree nearly 30 feet above ground. It was Peter Larkin, the missing logger. Or what remained of him. His body had been emptied from the inside. Bones stripped clean. Skin stretched tightly over hollow cavities. His eyes were gone. 3 more bodies were found within 2 days. Each displayed the same horrifying condition. The medical examiner resigned after the 3rd autopsy. Black River began collapsing under fear. Families fled town. Schools closed. Churches filled with terrified residents praying for protection. Meanwhile, strange sightings increased. People reported figures standing motionless at tree lines watching homes for hours. Several residents claimed they heard relatives calling to them from outside during the night despite those relatives being miles away. One elderly woman opened her door after hearing her dead husband's voice. She disappeared before morning. Daniel started recording interviews for a documentary, hoping logic might still explain the madness. But every story sounded impossible. One hunter described seeing a creature unfold itself from inside the carcass of a moose. Another swore he watched something crawl upside down across frozen branches high above the ground. None of it made sense. Then Daniel saw one himself. It happened just after midnight. He was driving home from the sheriff's station when movement appeared beside the road ahead. At first he assumed it was a deer. Then it stood upright. The thing stepped slowly into his headlights. Daniel slammed the brakes. For one frozen moment, he stared directly at it. It was at least 7 feet tall, impossibly thin, with pale skin stretched tightly over protruding bones. Its arms dangled below its knees. Black veins pulsed beneath translucent flesh. Its face looked unfinished. No nose. No ears. Only a huge mouth splitting nearly across its skull. And eyes. Large white eyes reflecting the headlights like dead glass. The creature tilted its head. Then it smiled. Daniel heard his own voice speak from its mouth. Help me. He screamed and accelerated backward, nearly crashing into a ditch before spinning the truck around. In his rearview mirror he saw the creature still standing motionless in the road. Watching him. When Daniel returned home, Eli listened silently. They are learning faster now, the old man said grimly. What are they? Daniel whispered. Eli stared into darkness beyond the window. Hungry. The next morning, Sheriff Briggs arrived with armed deputies. We found the valley, he said. Eli closed his eyes. Show me. They traveled north through worsening snowfall until they reached a narrow ravine hidden deep within the forest. The air there felt strangely warm despite the winter cold. Daniel noticed immediately that no animal sounds existed. No birds. No wind. Nothing. The valley opened before them like a wound in the earth. Dead trees surrounded a wide clearing where massive stones protruded from frozen ground. Many had been shattered recently by logging equipment. In the center yawned a dark pit descending into complete blackness. Daniel felt nausea instantly. The smell rising from the hole resembled rot mixed with wet earth. Deputies aimed flashlights downward. The beams vanished into darkness. How deep is it? Briggs asked. No one knows, Eli replied. One deputy muttered nervously, I don't like this place. Then they heard movement below. Scratching. Dozens of claws scraping stone. Everyone froze. The sounds grew louder. Something was climbing upward. Sheriff Briggs shouted for everyone to move back. A pale hand suddenly gripped the edge of the pit. Then another. A creature hauled itself partially into view. Its body looked horribly twisted, joints bending incorrectly beneath translucent skin. Its white eyes blinked rapidly against daylight. The deputies opened fire. Instantly, gunshots echoed across the valley. The creature shrieked with a sound like metal tearing apart. Then more screams answered from below. Many more. The pit erupted with movement. Shapes began climbing over one another toward the surface. Sheriff Briggs yelled for retreat. Everyone ran. Daniel glanced back once and wished forever that he had not. The creatures pouring from the pit were not identical. Some crawled on all fours. Others resembled emaciated humans stretched unnaturally tall. One had no face at all. Another moved backward using bent limbs like a spider. There were too many. The deputies fled through snow as screams echoed behind them. One man fell. Something seized him instantly. His cries stopped abruptly. Nobody looked back again. They barely escaped to the vehicles. Sheriff Briggs radioed for state assistance while Eli sat silently staring at the forest. They are awake now, he whispered. Within 48 hours, the National Guard established a perimeter around Black River. Officials publicly blamed a hazardous chemical spill for the evacuation orders. But soldiers soon encountered the creatures themselves. Entire patrols vanished during nighttime operations. Radio communications captured horrifying screams and distorted voices mimicking military commands. One recording later leaked online. It began with static. Then a soldier whispering, "There's someone outside the trees." Another voice responded nervously, "I can't see anything." Then came a woman's voice crying for help. The soldiers sounded confused. "Who the hell is that?" The crying grew louder. One soldier suddenly shouted, "Don't follow it." Gunfire erupted. Screaming followed. Then silence. The recording ended with wet chewing sounds. Panic spread beyond Michigan after the tape surfaced online. Federal authorities immediately shut down communications from Black River. Roads closed completely. Journalists disappeared from the area. Officially, nothing unusual existed. Unofficially, dozens were dead. Daniel continued documenting everything secretly. One evening he sat beside Eli while wind battered the cabin walls. "There has to be a way to stop them," Daniel said. Eli nodded slowly. "There may be." He retrieved another object wrapped in cloth. Inside rested a stone carved with ancient symbols. "My grandfather said the stone circles were not prisons." Daniel frowned. "Then what were they?" "Doors." The old man traced symbols across the stone carefully. "Our ancestors learned the Hollow Ones feared certain songs and fires. They forced them below ground during a winter long before Europeans came here." "How?" Eli looked tired suddenly. "With sacrifice." Snow hammered against the windows. Daniel swallowed uneasily. What kind of sacrifice? But Eli did not answer. The attacks intensified over the next week. Power outages spread across nearby counties. Entire homes were found abandoned with signs of violent struggle inside. Survivors described impossible horrors. One family claimed creatures crawled across their roof all night repeating their names. Another survivor described seeing pale faces pressed against windows during a blizzard. Every witness spoke of the eyes. White, empty, hungry. Then the mine was discovered. A National Guard helicopter searching the forest spotted a collapsed mining entrance hidden beneath snow several miles north of the valley. Records later revealed the mine dated back to the 1800s. Daniel, Sheriff Briggs, and Eli accompanied soldiers to investigate. Inside they found tunnels descending deep underground. And bones. Thousands of them. Human bones. Animal bones. Some ancient, others disturbingly recent. Symbols covered the tunnel walls in dried black paint. Many matched those on Eli's stone. The deeper they traveled, the warmer the air became. Then they reached a cavern. Daniel nearly vomited. The cavern walls pulsed. At first he thought it was an illusion. Then he realized the walls themselves were covered in living creatures clinging motionlessly to stone. Dozens. Maybe hundreds. Their white eyes opened simultaneously. The soldiers fired immediately. Chaos exploded through the cavern. Creatures launched from walls screaming. Gunfire echoed deafeningly while pale bodies moved impossibly fast through darkness. One soldier disappeared upward into shadows with a shriek. Another had his throat ripped open. Daniel ran beside Eli and Briggs through collapsing tunnels as creatures chased them. Behind them came voices. Human voices. Calling their names. Begging for help. Daniel heard his dead mother's voice clearly. "Danny, please." Tears filled his eyes despite knowing it was false. Sheriff Briggs stumbled beside him, pale with terror. "They're inside our heads," he gasped. Eli shouted over the screams. "Do not listen to them." The cavern shook violently. Explosions erupted behind them as soldiers detonated charges. Rock collapsed. Dust filled the tunnels. By the time they escaped the mine entrance, night had fallen. Only 6 soldiers survived. The rest were gone. A federal commander demanded immediate airstrikes on the valley and mine. Eli refused. "You will only open more tunnels." The commander angrily dismissed him. The bombing began at dawn. For several hours explosions thundered across the forest. Flames rose through snow-covered trees while helicopters circled overhead. Then came the screams. Not from the forest. From beneath the ground. The earth itself trembled. Roads cracked open. Buildings shook violently. Across Black River, residents heard impossible sounds echoing below their feet. That night the creatures came into town. The first attack struck the evacuation center at the high school gymnasium. Witnesses later described windows exploding inward as pale figures burst through darkness. People ran screaming. Emergency lights flickered red across blood-covered floors. Creatures moved among crowds with horrifying speed, tearing victims apart while mimicking human cries. National Guard troops opened fire, but many bullets seemed to barely slow them. Daniel arrived during the chaos with Sheriff Briggs. What he saw there haunted him forever. A creature stood in the middle of the gym holding a child gently in its arms. It looked almost curious. Then its jaw unfolded vertically into 4 sections. Daniel shot it repeatedly. Black blood sprayed across the floor. The child fell screaming. More creatures poured from hallways. Briggs shouted for retreat while soldiers evacuated survivors. Outside, snow fell heavily beneath burning streetlights. And everywhere in the darkness beyond town stood white eyes. Watching. Eli finally revealed the truth that night. "The Hollow Ones are not animals," he said. "They are what remains of something older than mankind." The survivors gathered silently around him inside the sheriff's station. "Long ago," Eli continued, "our ancestors believed these beings came from beneath the world during times of darkness. They fed not only on flesh but on memory, grief, fear. They learned human voices because they consumed human lives." One woman whispered shakily, "Can they be killed?" "Yes," Eli answered. "But not permanently." Silence followed. "They always return." Daniel stared at his grandfather. "Then how did your ancestors stop them before?" Eli's eyes lowered. "They sealed the doors using blood." Sheriff Briggs frowned. "What does that mean?" The old man looked exhausted. "One life freely given." Nobody spoke. Wind rattled the station windows. Daniel understood first. "No," he whispered. Eli met his eyes calmly. "I am old. You're not doing this. It must be done before winter solstice. Otherwise they will spread beyond the forests." Briggs shook his head angrily. "There has to be another way." Eli did not respond. Late that night Daniel followed his grandfather outside. Snow drifted through silent streets. "You knew this all along," Daniel said bitterly. Eli nodded. "You were planning to die. The stories always ended this way." Daniel's voice cracked. "I won't let you." The old elder placed a hand on his shoulder. "You think stories exist to entertain people. But stories are warnings carried through time. Our ancestors remembered because forgetting meant death." Daniel fought tears. "I finally understand that now." In the distance came faint screams from the forest. The Hollow Ones were gathering. The ritual began on the night of the solstice. Eli led a small group including Daniel, Sheriff Briggs, and surviving soldiers back to the valley. Snowstorms raged around them while strange cries echoed through trees. The shattered stone circles lay buried beneath ice and ash from the bombings. And the pit remained open. Warm air rose from darkness below. Movement flickered deep inside. Eli placed cedar, tobacco, and animal bones around the edge of the pit while chanting softly in Ojibwe. The forest grew silent. Then the creatures appeared. Hundreds emerged between trees surrounding the valley. Tall, thin, white-eyed, watching silently. Daniel gripped his rifle with trembling hands. None attacked. They simply stared at Eli. The old elder continued chanting. Wind howled violently across the clearing. One creature stepped forward. It wore the face of Daniel's mother. Perfectly. Her voice emerged softly. Daniel. He nearly dropped the rifle. Eli shouted sharply without stopping the chant. Do not listen. The creature smiled. Its face split apart. More creatures moved closer. Sheriff Briggs ordered soldiers to hold fire. The ground began shaking. Deep below the pit came an enormous sound unlike anything human. A breathing. Something vast stirred beneath the earth. Daniel realized suddenly that the hollow ones might only be servants. Eli raised the carved stone high above his head. Blood ran from cuts across his palms onto the symbols. The creatures shrieked simultaneously. The air filled with unbearable screams. Snow spiraled upward as if gravity itself reversed. Then Eli stepped toward the pit. Daniel lunged for him, but Sheriff Briggs held him back. No, Daniel screamed. Eli turned once. His expression remained peaceful. Remember the stories, he said. Then he jumped. The screams became deafening. Every creature in the valley convulsed violently. The pit erupted with blinding white light. Daniel covered his eyes. The earth shook so hard trees collapsed around them. Creatures shrieked and dissolved into black ash blowing across snow. The enormous breathing sound beneath the ground faded slowly. Then silence returned. Complete silence. The pit collapsed inward. Stone and earth sealed the opening completely. And just like that, it was over. Morning came gray and bitterly cold. The surviving soldiers departed within hours. Federal authorities quarantined the entire region and confiscated all records. Officially, a mining disaster and severe winter storms caused the deaths around Black River. Most Americans never heard anything else. But the people who survived remembered. Sheriff Briggs retired the following spring. Daniel remained in Black River. Years passed. The forest slowly reclaimed the destroyed logging roads and bomb craters. Snow covered old scars. Tourists returned eventually. Life continued. But strange stories never fully disappeared. Hunters still reported hearing voices deep in the woods during winter. Some claimed pale figures watched from tree lines on moonless nights. Others vanished entirely. Daniel spent years gathering testimony and preserving Eli's journals. He came to understand his grandfather had never expected belief from outsiders. That was never the purpose. Warnings rarely sound reasonable before disaster arrives. 20 years later, Daniel stood alone near the edge of the Black Woods during the first snowfall of winter. The trees stretched endlessly before him. Silent, ancient. He carried Eli's carved stone wrapped carefully in red cloth. The wind moved softly through the pines. For a moment everything seemed peaceful. Then Daniel heard it. A voice from deep within the forest. His grandfather's voice. Daniel. He froze. The voice came again. Gentle. Familiar. Calling his name from among the trees. Daniel closed his eyes slowly. Far beyond the forest, thunder rolled beneath the earth. And somewhere deep under Michigan's frozen wilderness, something hungry moved in the dark. Morning arrived beneath a gray and frozen sky, but Black River no longer felt like a real town. Smoke drifted above abandoned buildings, military trucks rolled slowly through snow-covered streets, and the silence hanging over everything felt heavier than death itself. The surviving soldiers packed their equipment without speaking much, avoiding eye contact with the locals as if they feared even mentioning what they had seen would somehow bring it back. Federal agents appeared before noon, sealing roads, confiscating cameras, notebooks, recordings, and every remaining document connected to the events in the forest. Official reports blamed a mining collapse, toxic gas leaks, and severe winter conditions for the disappearances and deaths. News channels repeated the same carefully written story for weeks until the country eventually forgot about Black River altogether. But the people who survived never forgot. They remembered the screams echoing through the woods at night, the white eyes watching from the trees, and the impossible voices calling to them in the dark. Sheriff Briggs retired the following spring, looking 20 years older than before, while many families left Michigan entirely, unable to live beside those forests anymore. Yet Daniel stayed. He could not leave the land where his grandfather had died saving countless lives. Over the years he dedicated himself to preserving Eli's journals, translating old Ojibwe stories, and recording testimonies from survivors before fear or age silenced them forever. Slowly he began understanding something his grandfather had known all along: stories were never meant only for entertainment. They were warnings carried across generations by people who had already seen horrors the world refused to believe. The ancient tales about the Hollow Ones had survived because forgetting them meant repeating the same nightmare again. As the years passed, nature reclaimed the scars left behind by the disaster. Snow buried the bomb craters, moss swallowed abandoned logging equipment, and thick forest slowly covered the ruined roads leading toward the Black Woods. Tourists eventually returned to nearby towns, unaware of what had happened beneath those trees decades earlier. Children played beside frozen rivers while hunters wandered the wilderness during autumn seasons, believing the old stories were nothing more than local legends meant to scare outsiders. But strange disappearances never completely stopped. Every few winters someone vanished in the forests north of Black River. Hunters occasionally reported hearing familiar voices calling their names from deep within the woods despite being completely alone. A few swore they saw tall pale figures standing silently among the trees during heavy snowfall before vanishing without leaving footprints behind. Most people dismissed those claims as imagination, isolation, or madness brought on by harsh winters. Daniel never dismissed them. He spent years studying Eli's stone, tracing the ancient symbols with careful fingers late into the night while storms rattled his cabin windows. Sometimes, during the coldest nights of winter, he thought he heard scratching sounds beneath the floorboards or distant cries drifting through the trees outside. And every single time, he remembered the final thing Eli had said before stepping into the pit: remember the stories. Those words haunted him because he finally understood their true meaning. Evil did not disappear simply because people refused to believe in it. Sometimes it waited quietly beneath the earth, growing stronger in darkness while the world moved on above it. 20 years after the night of the sacrifice, Daniel returned alone to the edge of the Black Woods during the first snowfall of winter. The forest stood silent beneath the pale moonlight, endless walls of black pine stretching into darkness like something alive and watching. He carried Eli's carved stone wrapped carefully in the same red cloth his grandfather had once used, and although he was older now, the memories returned instantly the moment he stepped near the trees. He remembered the screams, the blood staining the snow, and the impossible white eyes staring from the shadows. Cold wind moved softly through the branches overhead, carrying with it the scent of pine, frozen earth, and something older that he could never fully describe. For several long minutes nothing happened. The woods remained still, peaceful, almost. Then he heard it, a voice drifting softly between the trees. His grandfather's voice, calm, familiar, calling his name exactly the way Eli once had when Daniel was a child. Fear gripped him so suddenly he could barely breathe. The voice came again, deeper in the forest this time, gentle and patient, inviting him forward into the darkness beneath the ancient trees. Daniel closed his eyes tightly as memories flooded through him, because he finally understood the terrible truth Eli had tried to protect everyone from all those years ago. The Hollow Ones were never truly gone. The door had only been closed. And somewhere deep beneath Michigan's frozen wilderness, far below the forests and stone circles buried under snow, something enormous and hungry was beginning to wake once again. Daniel remained frozen at the edge of the trees while snow drifted slowly around him in the darkness. The voice sounded exactly like Eli's, carrying the same calm warmth that had guided him throughout childhood, and for one dangerous moment he almost answered it. The forest ahead seemed endless beneath the moonlight, black pine trunks stretching into shadow like pillars surrounding some ancient hidden world untouched by time. Then the voice called again, softer this time, deeper within the woods. Daniel felt the blood drain from his face because he understood immediately what was happening. The Hollow Ones were trying to reach him the same way they had reached everyone else, through memory, grief, and love. They learned human voices because they fed on human minds, pulling emotions apart until victims willingly walked into darkness themselves. Slowly Daniel tightened his grip around the red cloth wrapped over Eli's carved stone and forced himself to step backward instead of forward. The wind suddenly stopped. Complete silence swallowed the forest. No branches moved. No snow fell. It felt as though the entire wilderness had paused to watch his decision. Then, from somewhere impossibly deep below the earth, he heard it again, that massive breathing sound. Slow, ancient, patient. The ground beneath his boots trembled so faintly he almost imagined it, but a second later the vibration came again stronger than before, rolling through the frozen soil like distant thunder beneath the world. Daniel's heart pounded violently as memories returned of the final night at the pit, when something enormous had moved beneath the Hollow Ones like a sleeping god turning in darkness. Back then he had hoped Eli's sacrifice sealed everything forever. Now he realized the sacrifice had only delayed whatever waited below. He hurried back toward his truck as panic spread through him, but halfway down the trail he noticed something that made him stop instantly. Fresh tracks crossed the snow ahead. They had not been there earlier. At first glance they resembled human footprints, except they were far too long and narrow, pressed unnaturally deep into the ground as though whatever made them weighed several hundred pounds. Daniel's breath fogged heavily in the freezing air while he slowly followed the trail with his eyes. The footprints emerged from the trees on one side of the trail, crossed directly in front of him, then disappeared back into the forest on the opposite side. But there was something horribly wrong about them. The spacing between each print was impossible, nearly 10 feet apart, as if the creature walked with legs far longer than any human being could possess. Daniel felt terror tightening inside his chest while instinct screamed at him to leave immediately. Then he noticed another detail. Mixed among the fresh snow beside the tracks were smaller marks resembling human handprints. No, not handprints. Finger marks. Long grooves dug into the snow as though something had dragged its fingers while walking. A faint smell drifted through the air moments later, wet earth mixed with rot. Daniel backed away slowly, unable to stop staring toward the dark trees where the tracks disappeared. That was when he saw the eyes. Far between the pines, nearly hidden by darkness, two pale white circles reflected the moonlight. Motionless. Watching him, they stood far higher above the ground than a normal person's eyes should have been. Daniel stumbled backward toward the truck, never taking his eyes off the trees. Then more eyes appeared beside the first pair. Then another. And another. At least 6 figures stood silently among the forest shadows, tall shapes barely visible beneath falling snow, their pale eyes fixed directly on him without blinking. Daniel jumped into the truck and slammed the doors just as a deafening scream exploded from the woods behind him. The sound was so unnatural it barely resembled anything alive, like metal scraping against bone while dozens of human voices cried together underneath it. He started the engine instantly and sped down the frozen road while shapes moved between the trees beside him, impossibly fast silhouettes keeping pace with the truck despite the deep snow. The headlights shook violently across the road ahead as panic overtook him. In the rearview mirror he caught glimpses of pale figures darting silently from tree to tree, their limbs bending wrong whenever the light struck them. One of them suddenly emerged onto the road ahead, tall and skeletal with skin stretched tightly over protruding ribs. Daniel swerved violently, barely missing it before crashing through a snowbank along the roadside. The truck slammed hard against a fallen log and died instantly. Silence followed except for Daniel's ragged breathing. Snow drifted across the windshield while the forest around him remained completely still. Then came the scratching. Slow deliberate scraping sounds moved across the outside of the truck, circling it carefully. Daniel gripped the steering wheel in terror while condensation fogged the windows around him. A moment later something tapped softly against the driver's side glass. Daniel turned slowly and nearly screamed. A woman stood beside the truck. His mother. She looked exactly as she had before dying years earlier, snow resting gently on her coat while tears filled her eyes. "Danny," she whispered softly through the glass. "Please help me." Daniel's entire body shook. Every instinct begged him to open the door despite knowing it was impossible. His mother leaned closer toward the window. Then her smile widened too far across her face. The skin around her mouth began splitting slowly upward toward her ears while white eyes opened beneath her eyelids like milk rising through water. Daniel shouted in horror and fumbled for Eli's stone. The moment his fingers touched the carved symbols, the figure outside jerked backward violently. Its human shape collapsed instantly like melting wax, revealing a tall pale creature crouched against the truck with limbs bent like broken branches. It released an ear-piercing shriek and vanished into the darkness just as dozens of answering screams erupted deep within the forest around him.